Imagine making one decision at the age of 20 that quietly changes every year of your future without anyone noticing. Most people believed success came from one lucky opportunity, but Edward was about to prove that they were completely wrong. His friends spent money trying to look successful today, while Edward quietly focused on a future nobody else could see. At first glance, Edward looked no different from everyone around him. He earned an ordinary salary and lived an ordinary life. No expensive car, no luxury apartment. Nothing about his life suggested that he would become financially free one day. Every month, his paycheck arrived just like everyone else's. But one small decision made his life completely different. Nobody understood why he refused to spend money the same way his friends did. Some people even laughed at him because they believed he was wasting the best years of his life. They told him that life was meant to be enjoyed now, not planned 20 years in advance. Edward never argued with them because he knew something they had never taken the time to learn. Instead of buying things that quickly lost value, Edward quietly bought something that could grow with time. Every single month, before spending money on himself, Edward made the exact same decision without missing a single month. $500 disappeared from his bank account every month, but Edward never considered it an expense. He believed that every dollar he invested was another employee that would one day start working for him. His friend saw money as something to spend. Edward saw money as something that could produce even more money. At first, nothing exciting happened. His portfolio barely moved, and his life looked exactly the same. Months passed, and people around him became even more convinced that his plan would never work. What nobody realized was that the most powerful part of Edward's strategy had not even begun yet. The first dividend payment finally arrived, and the amount was so small that almost anyone else would have ignored it. Instead of spending that money, Edward made one decision that quietly changed the rest of the story. The first dividend was less than what Edward usually spent on lunch, and most people would have forgotten about it immediately. His friends certainly would have spent it without thinking, but Edward saw something completely different. He did not see a few dollars. He saw the beginning of a system that could eventually work without him, so he reinvested every cent and returned to his normal life without expecting immediate results. The next month, another dividend arrived, then another after that. The amounts were still small, but something important was happening beneath the surface. For the first time in his life, Edward owned assets that were producing money even while he slept. Most people spend years working for money. Edward was slowly teaching money how to work for him. 1 year passed, and his portfolio was still far from impressive in the eyes of other people. His friends pointed to the small numbers and claimed they had been right all along. Edward never argued because he understood a lesson most people never learn. The early years of investing are often the hardest because the rewards arrive painfully slowly. Many people quit during this stage because they mistake slow progress for failure. Edward refused to quit because he knew that compounding rewards patience more than intelligence. By the time he turned 25, 5 years of consistency had quietly changed everything. The portfolio that once looked insignificant now contained tens of thousands of dollars. More importantly, the dividend payments were becoming larger every single year. For the first time, the money generated by his investments could pay for some of his monthly expenses. His friends still earned more from their jobs, but Edward was building something entirely different. While they depended completely on their next paycheck, Edward was slowly building a second source of income that never stopped growing. By the time Edward turned 30, something incredible had happened. His investments were no longer depending only on his monthly contributions. They had started growing on their own. Every dividend payment bought more shares, and every new share generated even more dividends. The cycle repeated itself month after month. For the first time, Edward realized he was no longer building his portfolio alone. His money had quietly become his business partner. While Edward slept peacefully every night, hundreds of companies around the world continued working to increase the value of the businesses he owned. His friends still believed money only came from working harder. Edward had discovered another way. His monthly dividend incomes was now covering groceries, utility bills, and several everyday expenses without touching his salary. Most people celebrated payday once every month. Edward had quietly created days when money arrived even without working. The amount still wasn't enough to retire, but it was enough to prove that his plan had been working all along. Some of his old friends finally became curious. They wanted to know why Edward never seemed stressed about money anymore. They expected to hear about a secret investment or a lucky opportunity. Instead, Edward told them he simply repeated one small decision every single month. Most of them smiled politely and said they would start investing someday. Edward had once used the exact same excuse before taking action. He understood that the biggest obstacle was never a lack of money. It was waiting for the perfect moment that never arrived. Every year someone delays investing is another year that compound growth can never return. By 35, Edward's portfolio had grown larger than he ever imagined when he made that very first investment. His portfolio was now approaching $500,000, and the dividend payments kept increasing every single year. For the first time, his investments were earning more money each year than many people managed to save from their jobs. The beautiful part was that Edward never worked twice for the same dollar. Once invested, it continued working year after year. Looking back, Edward realized the hardest part had never been investing the money. The hardest part had been trusting the process long enough. Most people quit because they expect dramatic results too early. Edward succeeded because he expected nothing except consistency. Without realizing it, Edward had already reached the point where his money was growing faster than his own monthly contributions. At 36, Edward noticed something that once seemed impossible. His dividend income was now arriving faster than he had ever imagined, and every payment quietly purchased even more shares. The strange part was that Edward no longer felt excited every time a dividend arrived. It had become a normal part of his life. Years earlier, he had celebrated receiving only a few dollars. Now those payments had quietly grown into hundreds every month. His friends continued chasing higher salaries, but Edward had built something that kept paying him whether he worked or not. For the first time, Edward realized he was no longer worried about unexpected expenses. His investments had quietly become a financial safety net. He still went to work every morning, not because he had to, but because he genuinely enjoyed what he was doing. Money no longer controlled every decision he made. For the first time, Edward felt that he controlled his own future. Every month, the gap between Edward and his old friends quietly became a little larger, even though nobody noticed it happening. The difference was never intelligence. The difference was simply that Edward gave his investments enough time to grow. By the age of 40, his portfolio had crossed $1 million, a number that once felt impossible even to imagine. The portfolio itself was impressive, but what truly changed Edward's life was the income it produced every single month. Without selling a single share, his dividends were now paying thousands of dollars every month. The same $500 he once struggled to invest each month had quietly transformed into financial freedom. Looking back, Edward realized that the hardest investment he ever made was not the money. It was believing in a future that nobody else could see. The people who once laughed at his discipline were now asking him how he achieved what seemed impossible. Edward smiled because the answer had never been complicated. It had simply required patience longer than most people were willing to have. There was never a shortcut, a secret formula, or a lucky moment. Only hundreds of ordinary months connected by one extraordinary habit. Every dividend he reinvested years ago had quietly become another building block in the life he was living today. The future Edward once dreamed about had finally become his everyday reality, and it all began with one decision repeated every single month. What looked like an ordinary $500 investment at 20 had quietly become the decision that changed every year that followed. Years passed. The changes were so gradual that Edward barely noticed them happening. Every month looked ordinary, but together they quietly built an extraordinary future. One quiet afternoon, Edward looked back at the life he once dreamed about and realized he was already living it. The skills he learned, the habits he built, and the investments he patiently held had opened doors that once seemed impossible to reach. His confidence no longer came from the amount of money in his bank account. It came from knowing that his future was finally working in his favor. The investments he once protected so carefully were now producing enough income to give him choices that money alone could never buy. Nothing about his success happened overnight. Every dollar of freedom had been earned through years of patience, discipline, and consistency. The same habit that once looked small and insignificant had quietly become the strongest financial decision of his entire life. Every dividend he reinvested years ago continued producing even more dividends, creating a cycle that seemed almost impossible to stop. People often asked Edward which investment made him rich. They were surprised when he answered with a single word: time. Most people believe wealth comes from earning more. Edward discovered that lasting wealth comes from giving good investments enough time to grow. Looking back, Edward realized that every sacrifice he made at 20 had quietly purchased freedom at 45. He no longer worried about the next paycheck because his investments continued working every single day without asking anything in return. The greatest reward was never becoming wealthy. It was gaining the freedom to choose how he wanted to spend every new day. Many people spent decades chasing higher salaries. Edward spent those same decades building ownership instead. A single investment rarely changes a life. Thousands of consistent investments almost always do. The money Edward invested was important, but the habit he built was priceless. Success did not arrive because Edward found the perfect investment. It arrived because he refused to stop investing. Every month gave Edward another opportunity to invest in his future, and he accepted that opportunity again and again. The question was never whether $500 could change a life. The real question was whether someone could remain patient long enough to let it happen. 25 years earlier, Edward invested $500. Today, he owned something far more valuable than money. He owned his time, his freedom, and the future he had patiently built 1 month at a time.